Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Tim Russell, Vice President, Community Engagement and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for WTTW and WFMT. And on behalf of Sandra Cordova-Misek, our President and CEO, and our Board of Trustees, welcome to Forgotten Genius, Film Screening and Community Conversation. WTTW is committed to producing and presenting trusted, best-in-class content fueled by distinctly Chicago sensibility. We have served as Chicago's window to the world, and our purpose is to enrich lives, engage communities, and inspire exploration. Through our broadcast and digital platforms, we educate and entertain children and families and share the stories of women and men who have influenced Chicago, America, and the world. WTTW Screening and Community Conversations believes in the power of film to engage communities in dialogue around the world's most important social and cultural issues of our time. Our screening brings the best of PBS documentaries from NOVA, independent nonfiction filmmakers, Independent Lens, ITVS, Cartemquin Films, and POV, just to name a few. Our screening and community conversations have a particular focus on diversity with regards to both the filmmaker and the subject matter. We are honored to collaborate with NOVA on today's event. And I would like to give a special thank you to Gina Verimo and Ralph Bouquet for their partnership. Now, I would like to welcome Julia Quart, co-executive producer of NOVA.
Hello, everyone. I'm Julia Quart, the co-executive producer of NOVA, the PBS science series produced by GBH Boston. On behalf of my co-EP Chris Schmidt and myself, thank you so much for joining us this evening for a special screening and community conversation of NOVA's Forgotten Genius. At NOVA, we've always been dedicated to making the joy and power of science accessible to everyone, because science plays a major role in some of the most pressing challenges facing us: climate change, medicine, and public health, and the technology we all rely on every day. If we as a society are going to meet these challenges and find real solutions that benefit everyone equitably and fairly, then everyone needs to be part of the conversation. Science itself must be truly inclusive. NOVA is committed to promoting equity in science by telling science stories that are relevant and reflect the perspectives and experiences of all Americans. Percy Julian's story is an important reminder of how often scientific institutions have not been equitable and inclusive spaces for all people. Throughout Dr. Julian's career, he faced every possible barrier in a deeply racist and segregated America as he pursued his education and opportunities for research. As one of the first Black chemists, he fought to make a place for himself in a profession and country that constantly withheld opportunities from him. Yet by the end of his life, Dr. Julian had risen to the highest levels of scientific and personal achievement, overcoming countless obstacles to become a world-class scientist, a self-made millionaire, and a civil rights pioneer. This past Sunday, April 11th, was Dr. Julian's birthday. We hope that this film and the following discussion will serve as a celebration of his life and a reminder of the impact he had in shaping our world through his scientific contributions used in everything from birth control to many steroid-based medications. Tonight, you'll see an abridged version of the film, focusing on Dr. Julian's discoveries during his time with the Glidden Company and the violence the Julian family had to face while living in the Oak Park neighborhood in Chicago. If you haven't already, you can stream the entire 2-hour film for free online on WTTW's or NOVA's websites or on the PBS video app. I want to give a special thank you to Llewellyn Smith, the film's writer and director, who brought Percy Julian's story to life. I'd also like to thank the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the National Science Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Camille and Henry Dreyfuss Foundation, the American Chemical Society, and Mr. and Mrs. William G. Brown for making this film possible, along with NOVA's series funders, including PBS, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the NOVA Science Trust, and our corporate sponsor, Draper. And I want to particularly thank Tim Russell and WTTW for partnering with us on this event. I hope you enjoy the film and the conversation that follows.
I'm Sylvia Ewing. It's my pleasure to be your host with a microphone in a community discussion that is brought to you by partners NOVA and WTTW. And it's a perfect alignment because you have both the Midwest and a love of science. And my guests, who I believe can all hear me on this endeavor, will help us look at the documentary, uh, reflect on the context, and then we also want to hear from you. So start thinking about your questions. We'll put them in the chat and come to you later. I hope all that is a good use of the time and you agree with me. So I'm joined by Lou Smith, the writer and director of Forgotten Genius. Hey, Lou. Professor Akilah Siti Easter from the City Colleges of Chicago, also a scientist, biology and physiology. And you saw her when she was a little younger in the documentary. Dr. Katherine Julian, who is a medical doctor at the University of California in San Francisco. So this is how you do it virtually. Applause, applause. So our friends in the audience have just seen a phenomenal documentary. I'm just going to come around to each of you for a very brief reaction to what you saw. And I'll come to you last, Lou, because you had a little bit to do with it. But Professor Easter, seeing these excerpts, which people can see the full documentary, what's your biggest takeaway about Professor Julian and this documentary?
Thank you, Sylvia. My biggest takeaway is I can't imagine what would have happened if we were just left alone, or Dr. Julian was just left alone and was allowed to allow his genius to thrive. If he didn't have all of the obstacles that was brought in front of him, how much better could he have been? He wasn't even satisfied, and he was at genius level. So I just wonder what would happen if he did not have all of the obstacles in front of him.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us. Dr. Julian, your thoughts?
You know, I agree a lot with Dr. Easter. I think, you know, it's clear that to be able to solve some of the really tremendous problems we have facing our society, we need diverse voices, and we need to harness the genius that is out in the community. And I think this really shows that my grandfather's genius was there, and he was absolutely able to make contribution, but imagine what he could have done had those obstacles not been in front of him.
Thank you. And Lou, you had so much to do in translating this story for us. What do you hope will be an audience's biggest takeaway?
I agree with what's already been said. I think that as I'm watching this piece, and I haven't seen the ending, it's interesting. I haven't seen the ending for a long time. You know, it's just, I think it's a powerful story, not the film, but so much his life. And I think that it would be wonderful for people to take away from his story, what the possibilities are. You know, I mean, that's what's so extraordinary for me, is that he was able to achieve so much despite the kind of obstacles that he was facing. And, you know, to deny anyone the chance to sort of be their fullest self is kind of criminal. And so I think that's what sort of stays with me is trying to imagine this man looking at his life and believing in what he actually could achieve, and knowing that it wasn't fraud, it was real. His genius was real, and still be having to struggle to have it nurtured and developed and accomplish the things that he hoped to accomplish. And probably in the end, he only accomplished a fraction of what he could have done. So yeah, it's a very inspiring, but it's a very poignant and even painful story.
Well, along those lines, and staying with you briefly, he reached the highest heights of his field, in spite of all of the barriers that were put in his way. And that field of science was incredibly racist and not equitable. What, if anything, has changed today? And I'll stick with you, Mr. Smith.
Generally speaking, I mean, I've continued to work with NOVA, and we've done some, extraordinary work that I'm very proud of. In the course of that work, it's been interesting to sort of read the discussion of exactly what you're talking about, the fact that has been a closed field. And I think the danger of that, and it is a danger, is not so much that, that African Americans should be, or people of color, or anybody should be a part of that science work. But, the danger is, again, that, when we close people out, we're closing out a whole population of people who have so much to add in terms of their perspective and what they could understand and help us understand. The questions, it also seems to me that I think about this is that within the field of science, the questions that are deemed important to follow, who's deciding those questions? So then you get into thinking about, well, what populations are being, what kind of diseases are we paying attention to? What populations are we concerned about? What environments are we concerned about? So it's not simply just showing up and wanting to have the right number of people of color, the right number of women. It's really thinking about that science is not, it's always driven, it seems to me, by all kinds of things, including, the need for the resources for research, but it's also what questions are we asking?
It's not just checking the box. You're not going to get innovation by checking the box.
Absolutely not. And we're at a place where we're desperate for innovation in science in terms of the things that we're being challenged with. So I don't want to go much. And then there are people. My other colleagues could say much more about that than I can. But that's the thing that really strikes me.
We're just getting started. So we're just getting started. There's plenty of time to share very valid points. And I would even add people who are closed out because they're incarcerated. But let me come to you, Dr. Julian. What, if anything, has changed today? You're, in the medical field. You understand what's going on in the world.
I do think that science is really beginning to value the importance of diversity and diverse voices, and that is how we're going to solve some of the really wicked problems that we have in science. I think, to lose point though, we still continue to have such inequity in health, in education, in socioeconomics. And that's really, I think, where we are struggling, as a society. And I think that that's really going to be the challenge that everyone needs to work on, honestly. As a scientific community, as a country, in the world, is really how can we best harness all of the talent that we have and really allowing everyone to succeed and to be their best selves, to really work together to solve the inequities that we have.
Yeah, it makes me think of that term, we can't afford to leave anybody behind. You mentioned education. I'm going to come to Professor Akilah Siti Easter, City College of Chicago, my hometown friend. There's a quote that is in the larger documentary. Education was fraught with unequal preparation and access. And that really struck me so deeply, that the structures being designed to be unequal before someone even starts. So does that same question apply today, or that same term, both in education and in the science field?
I most definitely agree with that. I did not see my first scientist, a Black scientist, until I went to college. I grew up in Iowa, so I never even saw a Black scientist until I came to college, and my instructors were actually a reflection of me. And I know that and for some of my students within the city colleges, I may be the only Black scientist that they encounter as well. So I kind of understand their pathway a little bit more, I think, and I think that's why we do need that, so that we don't allow this unequal representation or this unequal education to be perpetuated. Piggybacking on what Dr. Julian said with the health inequities, Black women are at the top for Black maternal death, those different types of things. And it's due to the lack of knowledge and the lack of exposure and the lack of doctors that are representing us. And I think that a lot of myths are perpetuated because we don't have enough representation of people who look like us within the education and scientific realm.
Well, and we're really starting to see within this documentary, just in what we've shared together, his commitment, his resilience, his passion. And there was a term that I also heard about, contagious enthusiasm for discovering the unknown. And just sticking with you, Professor Easter, that really struck me, because even, years later in storytelling, you could see his enthusiasm for learning and inspiration. What does it mean to have these kinds of mentors and teachers today?
I'm laughing because I have moments in my lectures where I tell my students I'm nerding out right now. So I tell them, like, okay, we're nerding out right now. I said, do you understand all of these different connections? Do you see this caused this? And I can see them laughing at me, right? So I'm like, but that excitement and that enthusiasm is what allows them to kind of get engaged, right? To try to figure out. I always challenge my students. I say, I know that you may not remember everything that we go over in this textbook, but what I want you to do is I want you to be able to learn how to understand things. That is my goal as a scientist. And that's what science is, understanding the unknown. So I challenge my students to try to figure out the unknown. And I am very enthusiastic about it, to the point where they have to, they will text, because, we're in Zoom right now. They will say, you're zooming out, you're nerding out, Professor Easter. So I understand that enthusiasm that allows for that engagement for students. And that's why it's kind of funny to me. I think Dr. Julian was very direct. I am also very direct as well. And I think that that's a good combination to allow our students to learn and engage within the scientific realm.
Well, that's a wonderful story. And it makes me want to find out if there are any other stories as a Julian, if that contagious enthusiasm and energy was something that you saw as a child. I'm grandma, I'm action grandma, so I hope there's some good stories that my grandchildren will tell, but you were close to a genius. What was that like?
I think my grandfather was absolutely driven in everything that he did, obviously driven in work. Driven, even when folks wanted to drive him out of Oak Park, he was not going to move. Driven in gardening, someone who would get up and spend an hour and a half gardening before going to work, and then, working an incredibly long day. And so that drive absolutely came through. And I think the other thing that came through in my family was the value of education, and that education was paramount. That was the most important thing. And I think the other piece that came through was you have to work twice as hard as anyone else to be thought of as half as good. That was really the message that came through. So you had to be driven in your studies. You had to work hard to really be viewed as equal.
And he was a competitive gardener. I can see that energy and all that he did. Thank you for sharing that. Coming to you, Lew Smith, the writer and the director of this phenomenal documentary, in your story selection, there's a part where the Midwest, which was a home where Dr. Julian was hired and his career grew, but the Oak Park incident was not our shining moment. Talk about the choices you made in telling that story and why it was so important it seemed to me, you didn't just tell it from an adult's perspective. It seemed to me that you had this this full view of what it was for young kids, what it was for neighbors, what it was for others. Can you talk about that a bit?
Certainly. Steve Lyons was one of the who's no longer here, the late Steve, terrific filmmaker and writer.
I saw the dedication.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he died before the film was shown again. But our collaboration, in the collaboration, we talked a lot about how we wanted to sort of show as much of the different dimensions of Percy Julian as possible. So it was not just him in the laboratory, but it's really think about what about his life with his relationship with his family. What about his life as an entrepreneur? What about his life? So just sort of really trying to look at these different dimensions. So the Oak Park story, I mean, it seemed natural to tell it from the child's point of view because we have the person who was there, who actually, was thinking about it and talking about it. And I'm glad you mentioned it because I think that's one of my, I like that story because it's told largely from what the child was, what Julian was thinking as a child, and was experience of the whole story as a child. And I often think, and I think that that's one of the pieces that I would love to have gotten more of, because I don't think it would have been very easy to have not just parents who are really driven and really, convinced and wanted to sort of make you come to a higher place in terms of achievement, but also what is it like when your parents are trying to transform a neighborhood or even transform a world? And well, that's got to be very challenging for a kid, because sometimes I'm sure there are times when they would not have wanted to be that child who's in that situation.
Yeah.
For all kinds of reasons, and so there's a lot of complexity. There's just to say that there's a lot of complexity we're going for that we weren't able to achieve. I think at some point,
you did a wonderful job. Okay, you did a wonderful job.
I know, but my point is, at some point, somebody's really going to sit down and go after all of the things we couldn't and weren't able to reach in the story.
You do
and that's
it.
Going to be it. When that happens, it's going to be really extraordinary, because a lot his story is just sort of profoundly rich, and I also think part of it's so rich also because he, as we've already mentioned, he was under such pressures all the way along. I mean, sort of at every single moment. And he was aware of that. And that's got to be a very complicated thing to sort of say, I know who I am in terms of what my potential, what I have to offer. And I know, and it's under assault every single step of the way.
And I have to suffer fools repeatedly and sometimes with courtesy. So much there. And I was smiling because we talked earlier, some of us have kids, and we often embarrass, right? We often embarrass. But the depth of what young people went through, for your parents to hear on the news that your home has been attacked, it really puts things in perspective. So I'm Sylvia. Thank you for patience with technology. I might freeze up a little bit, but I'm not going anywhere. And you're joining WTTW and NOVA for this abbreviated screening, which we just saw, of the Forgotten Genius documentary. And I'm here with an exceptional panel of the writer and director, Llewellyn Smith, Professor Easter from City Colleges, another scientist, and Katherine Julian, Dr. Katherine Julian, our Professor Julian's granddaughter. And we're going to come to you for some questions before hearing more from the panel. And one that came through relates a little bit to what we were talking about earlier, Professor Easter. How can we ensure that more scientists, engineers, and inventors are being recognized during Black History Month and beyond? And I think the other part that I think you can really relate to as well is, what can Black families do to ensure that students get high quality science education? and this person had strong feelings. We have to do something instead of waiting for systems to change. What can we do now? So Black History Month, if you want to take that because of academia, and then what can families do?
Well, in my house, Black History, there's no month. It's year round. So my daughter's constantly, so we are constantly, I speak of the unknowns, right? So a lot of times, if we're going back to Black History Month, we learn about 4 people, Frederick Douglass, Dr. King, and not to diminish their accomplishments. But we do understand the major contributions if you learn your history and understand your history, which was an emphasis in my house because I grew up around people who did not look like me. So my parents were very focused on making sure that I did have that representation. So I knew who I was growing up, even though people did not look like me around me, or people would tell me that I am not like them. So that's the emphasis of making sure within the home that you are focusing, you are doing your research as a parent to learn those different things. My daughter, she has little science kits and things like that. So I'm biased. So I'm like, you can be whatever you want to be, but here's your science kit. So I try to teach her these things early. My love for science came, I remember when I think I was 4 or 5, I got a red microscope. And I would go to the back to the creek and get little creek water and look at things through the microscope. Foster those things with your children, and constantly asking why is another reason I'm in the science realm. I never fell out of that phase, when 4 or 5-year-olds, I still ask why. So challenging people to take the next step to get an understanding, I think would allow kids to be in love with the world around them. When they start to learn how the world works around them, when they learn how their bodies work and all the systems work together, make it a game just as fun as music is and sports and all those other activities, which I did all of those as well. But my interest came in science. That's where my heart fell in love. I fell in love with the scientific world. So just challenging your kids and introducing those unique things to them.
If I can just add, and I agree with that. And I was going to say, if I can add, the other thing I would say is I'm really thankful that when I was raising my kids when they were young, I didn't have a smartphone. And that's not to say anything bad about technology, but I think to your point, you want to engage with your kids. You want to, ask questions, hear their questions, talk about what are the possibilities. And I think I worry about children being so consumed by technology. And of course, I know we're all doing Zoom school, but I think it really will often bring kids inward instead of looking outward at what the possibilities are and asking questions.
That is a brilliant point, Julian. Yeah, please.
No, if I could, I think that what you both in some ways are also underscoring is the idea that it's okay and it's actually cool and it's good to be interested in these things, and that there's a value in that. I think that sometimes my concern sometimes is that we don't model that it's actually good to sort of go down these roads that aren't connected to the iPhones or other kinds of things, that you can actually discover science and learn about science yourself.
Yeah, well, there's so much there that you're all sharing, from modeling the behavior, media literacy, and stepping back from our glowing rectangles to really be able to give our spin on their question, which maybe the search engine might not. But another question, and this one is for you, Dr. Julian. What do you think Dr. Percy Julian's ethical stance would be on genetically modified plants for the purpose of feeding people living in poverty around the world? So pretty specific. Because he was modifying back then, but that question.
Right. Obviously I'm speculating, but I think, he was someone who really wanted to work to, better society, right? And to work for the common good. And so I think, he would have been looking for ways to reduce health inequities. And if that meant, using science to leverage that and harness that, I think he would have done that.
Yeah, it's just, I think that people just stopping for a second, and if you have a question, don't hesitate to put it in the chat. But to think about all the ways that he touched our lives. I will admit, there was a school that I often drive by. Knew he was a scientist, didn't know a lot, you know, of our in our rich Chicago history, but everything from women's reproductive health to people with bad knees like me, you know, or with cortisone. He was actively engaged in our world in so many ways. Another question for Dr. Julian, and then I have some questions for you all. How many have any of the institutions that mistreated your grandfather ever apologized for their actions? And we did see in the film that people were trying to catch up later. And how can we hold these institutions accountable for the generations of harm they caused Black people? I think any of you can answer this question. Have they apologized? And then how do we hold folks accountable?
To my knowledge, they have not apologized. I think, you know, this is actually something in higher education that is being talked about, is how do you reckon with the past and really reckon with the wrongs of the past, and then also move forward in a really productive way. And I know there are many, many universities that are having this discussion, because obviously there's been so many universities that honestly have been built on pillars of racism. And you know, and obviously that is something that they're reckoning with, and is just incredibly challenging. And so I think that it is absolutely something that is being talked about at many, many top universities.
Yeah, and reparations are being talked about. I was at the University of Chicago's, they have a new name, but it was the School of Social Service Administration, and they hung banners for women who were absolutely missing in their foyer. All the sort of the mothers of their field got recognized later. Professor Easter, what do you think about all of those questions?
I think textbooks are starting to recognize more. More textbooks are speaking of who Henrietta Lacks is, more of the Tuskegee experimentations, those different types of things. These are things that when I present to my students, they have no idea these different types of things happen. I think the CDC has addressed issues with the Tuskegee experimentation. So I think textbooks are starting to acknowledge and putting a little bit more history within the textbooks, but it depends on, as an instructor, which books you choose. Are they being equitable, and are they including the history that led to these different discoveries? Even with DNA, we don't talk about Rosalind Franklin, we talk about Watson and Crick. So I know I'm throwing these names around, but we're talking about, we're giving the recognition to people. I'm starting to see more and more textbooks starting to acknowledge that.
Well, that's some positive change. Thank you for sharing. And Lou Smith, there was a part of the excerpts that we saw where there was a push, of course, to get him involved in greater recognition, but people were bending over backwards to give him honorary doctorates. Is there any more that you want to say about that?
No, I think it's. I don't know. There may have been more awards that we didn't recognize or didn't find, but I imagine it's sort of the moment of people recognizing that it's the cousin of the moment we're in now. There's a sort of a recognition that harm has been, not just that harm has been done and has to be acknowledged, but also that, you know, this is an extraordinary man at the end of his life. And so he starts to have all these recognitions and all these honors bestowed on him. And I don't think it was insincere at this. At the same time, I think it's sort of one of those things that you sort of, but why wait? Why did you wait? Why did you wait? Why did you wait until it became comfortable and comfortable to and the best time to do this, you know?
And safe.
Yeah, but yeah, I think it was really because there was a moment toward the end of his life where people were sort of recognizing that he was, and as I've said numbers of times, it sort of struck me that that within the science, within the field, he was very well known. I mean, you heard the story about the conference that all these white scientists got together and said, no, he's got to be here. This guy's This guy's one of the leading, he is the leading researcher in this field. Of course he's got to be here. So, I mean, and that always struck me as well, you know, that at least that in this moment, there are people who are his colleagues who are white and working other places. They know who this man is. And he's done, and they're building their own work based on his research. So of course they want him to be there. It just takes a longer while, obviously, for the rest of the public to recognize who this man is and that he's an extraordinary person.
Well, his entire story is an example also. Not saying he was a super patient person from what I've heard, but things don't happen overnight. His business, his ability to lead came after 18 years. And then eventually, you know, his peers recognized him. And the fact that people outside of science started to know his name is also a testament to the power of his personality. But it also strikes me that it is a testament to his willingness to speak up about race and injustice. So in American history, that fight for racial equality, there are often privileged Black folks that were reluctant to engage politically or attempted to opt out in many ways. And that just was not the case for him. You know, why was he so active? And why did it matter? And I'm going to just come to, you know, a family source. Katherine Julian, what do you think?
I think there's probably several reasons for that. One is, you know, back to being driven. You know, he was just so incredibly driven. And I think obviously able to see how unfair things were, you know, how he had worked so hard, you know, in education, all throughout his education, and to really have to struggle to be able to just do the work that he was passionate about. So I think that was really one piece. I think, you know, when he obviously knew the value of education. And so I think as he was moving through his career, I think he really felt an obligation to help others who were coming behind him, you know, as evidenced by all the scientists that he employed. But I also think the other piece that, you know, we haven't really talked about is the fact that he was also married to an incredibly powerful woman as well. And I know the longer version of the story tells a little bit about my grandmother, but she was accomplished in her own right, and she was not a shrinking violet. And, you know, it really took the two of them to decide they were going to stay in Oak Park. Obviously, you know, my grandfather as well, but it was really a decision that the two of them made. And so, you know, I think it was just an incredible partnership that they had. And I think that's also really important to acknowledge.
It is. I know she was a PhD, and Lou Smith, you probably want to share even more about her part of the story.
I think we have, yeah, it's actually, as I'm thinking about it, you're right. That whole section is not even what folks saw. But, you know, she was a PhD in fact, I think that she was the first African American woman to get a PhD in sociology.
Yes, she was.
I believe that's right. Yeah. No, she was, and so so that would have been an interesting conversation. See, you know, she's got this immense sort of track that she's already, you know, set to move on, but she pulls it back, you know, really to support him in a way. And that would have been an interesting conversation to find out what was decided there.
She did continue in her own right in terms of, I mean, obviously raising a family and supporting his career. And, you know, she also really partnered with him in just many, many charitable efforts and helping others. So I think you know, like I said, it really was a partnership with the two of them.
No, yeah, I got that sense as well. Absolutely.
And for her era, she was definitely active, you know, because that just being Mrs. Percy Julian had its responsibilities, let alone the children, and fighting off, you know, neighbors who weren't welcoming. I love the fact that then later people signed a petition and stood with the family. So important. He was clearly a brilliant and inspiring employer. How much did his charming communication skills have to do with his broader success? And I'm going to come to the professor here, because it seemed that his style that wasn't the common style of the era to speak so directly and plainly. Please speak to that, Professor Easter.
I think there's a couple things with that. One, that he had the audacity. He had the audacity to be able to speak up, to let people know how intelligent he was. Oftentimes, I think during that time, you had to hide that, or you had to not let the majority feel less. So that was something that stood out to me, how Dr. Julian was like, look, I am an intelligent person. I'm going to let you know that I am. And I'm going to, if you're not going to offer something to me, I'm going to figure out a way on my own to do that. And he did not fit the stereotypical scientist either. If you think about a scientist, if everybody closes their eyes right now, and you say the word scientist, he probably was not what you would envision, on many different aspects. But having that charisma is what allowed him, I believe, to be able to communicate to others why he was important and why he was significant and why his science was significant as well. So he had that perfect combination, I believe, that confidence. And I say audacity, not in a negative way, but I think in that time it was perceived as audacity. How dare you feel that you're on the same level as us? And I think we still see that today. We still see that today within the workplace. And I think I experienced that as well. So I think he had that perfect combination.
Yeah, he didn't hold back who he was in any way. And we have to remember the background that we didn't get into here because we wanted to focus on the science period, the Glidden period, etc. of his career. But his family, his ancestors were all of ours, but they were previously enslaved people. He came from Alabama. He saw lynchings, and as a child actually saw someone, who had recently been murdered. And so that part of the long trajectory is really fascinating to me, when we think about it. And there does seem to be a time, and I want to come to you, Katherine Julian, and I'll just remind people that we're watching a community conversation about fabulous documentary, Forgotten Genius, with a panel of experts, and your questions. You have a little time to get a couple of them in, but we're coming into the finish line for our conversation. The tensions between generations, the conversation about when younger Black folks were no longer patient, didn't want to wait. We see some of that happening now with Black Lives Matters. It's probably cyclical, with every generation trying to push the next one on a little more. But according to what we saw today, towards the latter part of his life, he realized that just being an example alone wasn't enough. So I'm wondering about any of the generational solidarity or intergenerational solidarity that you might have witnessed in your home. And I'd love to hear about what we're seeing with young people today who are perhaps engaged in social change alongside older folks, as well as pushing them along. So I'll come to you first, Dr. Katherine Julian.
I think, history repeats itself, right? It is often the younger generation that gets impatient and does move things along. I think we saw that in the 1960s, and I think we're seeing it now. And honestly, I think technology, with all of the terrible racist current events that are happening, now we do have smartphones and we do have technology, and the videos of those go viral and shock everyone, including the older generation. And I think it really honestly helps all of us become impatient for change. And I think that it really is harnessing the energy of young people that makes us better and is going to move us along, which I think is incredibly important. I often think of Martin Luther King Jr.'s quote about, the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think that's absolutely right. And I'm hopeful and confident that will continue to be the case.
Thank you. And Professor Easter, what are you seeing with the young people that you engage with?
I think young people are willing to listen. I think they're more interested in our history. They're learning more about history, and I think technology has allowed that to happen. I think they're seeing the roots of a lot of the things that are present nowadays. And I think this generation, or these younger generations, they're in more solidarity with across all ethnicities. And I think that is allowing the voices to be stronger against inequities, where we're having a joining. I mean, I know collectively we have worked together in the past, but we're starting to see a whole generation starting to see that these things are not right. And they're coming together. I think there's a lot more solidarity with these younger generations. I believe it is my duty to represent and to be a representation in front of that generation. So I believe that's what I strive to do. And I do join with them. I have been in the protests with them and those different types of things. And I believe that I should be a mentor to them, but let them lead the way.
So beautiful. We can help them see around some corners and we can learn from them. This is a question that I'm not sure, maybe we can get it from the film, but does the estate hold the 109 patents, or did he just get $1 for them or something like that? But
he just got $1.
Yeah,
he got $1.
They probably heard it and couldn't believe it. So, but you know, when I saw that, what he got as a door opener, you just open the door a crack to him and give him that research laboratory. And before you know it, he's researching things on their time that he's interested in. He eventually hires so many people, and he did become a millionaire later. So it's all good. And then someone else from our audience, and thank you so much for joining us, said, I'm inspired by Percy Julian's engagement in civil rights efforts as a scientist, a little bit like we talked about. How can we promote engagement of scientists today in the civil rights and social justice issues we're facing? I wonder if that's a scientist asking, but that's the question. How he did it, can others?
I think, Lou talked a little bit about this earlier, which is it's about the questions we're asking, right? And we need to be asking the right questions. And I think that's where really harnessing all of these scientists that we do have and really making sure that we can have appropriate diversity in our scientific community is just incredibly important.
Smith?
I completely agree. I completely agree. I think that, we are at a place where we can't continue to pretend that the politics and the social world that's happening doesn't come into the work that we're doing, and whatever that work is, and especially if that work is science. And it's already there because you're a human being and you bring your own biases, or you're working on a particular piece and it's researched or supported by a particular group and they have their own direction. I think we have to. I think we, all of us. But if I was a scientist, I'm not a scientist. But we have to not be afraid to ask those questions about where is this going, and is this going where it should be going? Are the people who we want to serve being served? Who's being left out of this whole these pieces of research or these inquiries, or what communities are not being considered? And I think that's the. I think that, to me, that's the piece that sort of keeps coming back to me in terms of whatever work it is, but especially I think in the case of science, which pretends, or we pretend is very neutral and it's just pure. But of course, it's like everything else. It's driven and shaped and directed by human beings. And so it has our human hand on it, and we should recognize that.
Well, and we see that human hand on everything from coding to everywhere we touch. It seems like we take some of our worst habits with us, and we have to work to make things better. Coming to Professor Easter as we almost wrap up our time together, you saw all of the challenge, the struggle that Percy Julian had as a Black scientist. You know, how does that speak to your experience, and were there clear improvements, or do you still see a long way to go?
I think there's always going to be that room for improvement. I don't know what I would have done if I didn't have Black mentors that were in the scientific realm. So I think that's going to be the major key, is to have more and more representation, so that students who are trying to become scientists can speak to somebody who understands their obstacles. Not people just telling them these are the problems and this is what we think the solution can be, but you have somebody who can actually empathize with you and understand your struggle and give you a heads up. A lot of my mentors gave me a heads up of what you're going to encounter, and it was a checklist. I was like, oh, yep, said this was going to happen, and they gave me the heads up, so I did not think I was going crazy. It's kind of echoing what you said before, and this has been passed down in my family as well. But many of my mentors said, Akilah, you need to be twice as good, and they're not even going to give you credit. So that having that representation is significant, and making sure that you are coming back and pulling people up with you along the way, not just getting, I think you kind of alluded to that a little bit earlier with the social classes. When you get your money, why should I keep fighting and go back and help others? But I believe that we need to start to pull up the rest of the people behind us and make sure that we are mentoring them and supporting them.
And
the other piece, I was just going to say, the other piece I would add with regards to mentorship, and I do think having diverse mentors is important, and allyship is also important. You know, as we know, obviously I'm in academic medicine, and as we know in academic medicine, the pipeline is incredibly leaky, meaning our learners are diverse, and then, you know, they get less and less and less diverse, you know, as you move up the academic line. And so I think, you know, allies are important. In terms of mentoring and making sure we're mentoring across differences, and that when we are serving as mentors, we're looking at that diversity. I think that's just really important.
That is an incredible point, and I'll give each of you a chance for your final thoughts. But I was thinking more about your grandmother, Dr. Julian. All of that mentoring, you know, that role modeling, all of that was something that she was a part of as well. And I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that there are young Black and other couples out there that are going to take on this mantle. I've reached that age where I'm counting on you to fix things. I'll help you where I can. But I'm hoping that this has been an inspiration. We've been having a community conversation brought to you by the partners NOVA from WGBH and my home station, WTTW in Chicago, with Tim Russell and the CEO and all of his colleagues. And thank you to everyone at NOVA who made this possible and who have walked us through these interesting times of remote everything. Thank you for joining and for your thoughtful questions and your curiosity, which we hope doesn't stop here. I'm just going to ask each of our guests to say some parting thoughts about the legacy that we saw portrayed this evening. And I'll come to you first, Professor Easter.
I think we should understand the significant impact that Dr. Percy Julian has left on within the scientific realm and even within the social justice realm. And I think those two combined factors is what made him leave such a strong legacy. And I think that we should challenge ourselves to do the same thing, not just be complacent and not be comfortable where we are, but to challenge what the majority is saying and understand that don't let anybody tell you who you are. You can show them who you are.
I love it. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to come to you, Lou Smith, because it echoes a little bit of what you said. You know, scientists, you have to do your work and you have to do more. But what are your thoughts on his legacy and your last words for our audience?
Well, I think it's been, first of all, it's been terrific to join you all and be part of this. I think of when I think of Dr. Percy Julian, I think about sort of examples I've had in my own life and the importance of examples in different fields. The idea that someone can be in a field and sort of represent. We're not always representing or seeing the people that we need to mentor us. I mean, you can go, you can be in, you can imagine being in science, and as it's already been discussed, and not having people who look like you, and the challenge of sort of feeling like you really belong there, if you don't have those people around you, whatever the field is. So he just strikes me as so important in terms of having sort of broken these barriers, and at the same time, you know, I think his legacy is bittersweet. I mean, it's in multiple directions. There's what he was able to achieve as a scientist, but also his pioneering work in civil rights, in fair housing. But then again, also the fact that he was not able to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish. He knew what he could accomplish, and he knew what he's being denied in terms of what he wanted to accomplish. And so there's the achievement of Dr. Julian, which reflects the racism of his time. So you have to hold on to both. You can't really hold on to one without holding on to the other, because each one is showing light on the other. So it's a complex legacy, and it's a lot to hold on to, I think.
Reflects the racism of the time. Dr. Katherine Julian, thank you so much for your time, your family story. What are your last thoughts?
I guess I would say, you know, obviously, in addition to what everyone else has shared, just, you know, this is showing the amazing power of one, meaning, you know, what one person can accomplish, despite all of the barriers and obstacles. And if we as a society can really work to dismantle racism and remove barriers in front of our young people across this country, think of what we could accomplish, right? Think of all the genius that is out there that maybe we haven't even discovered yet. And so I would say that would be a really important legacy. And lastly, I'd just really like to say thank you to Lou for, you know, telling the story and really making it available to others. And obviously, thank you to NOVA for supporting this.
Well, thank you all so much to reflect on. He never had ideal conditions, but he did so much despite that. And then I think, could he have lived 10 more years if life hadn't been so hard on him in the early days? I loved the conversation with all of you, and I just want to leave families, parents, grandparents, concerned allies with these thoughts. What he struggled through is cyclical. We have been fighting racism and having moments of hope since Reconstruction. What can we do to make this moment the kind of moment that a forgotten genius like Percy Julian would be proud of? And the urgency with our earth and all of the challenges we face means that we have to start making those positive changes ourselves, being door openers and not gatekeepers, just like he was, and do it now. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.